My name is Simon Lacey. I am head of Digital Trade and Geopolitics at the World Economic Forum in Geneva, Switzerland. There are plenty of areas where US and Chinese interests align. I mean, this is the first and second largest economy in the world, with some of the largest commercial networks from their firms spread out through the world. So the stability of the global financial system, the ability of their companies to operate and trade abroad, both sort of key interests, and that those are areas where they can cooperate. So in terms of financial stability, there are fora like the Bank of International Settlements, but also areas where they can promote more cooperation in terms of the governance of the financial system, the stability of the financial system. And then on trade, I mean, one area where people actually tend to think that Chinese and US interests conflict, which is freedom of navigation, is actually an area where they have mutual and aligned interests, because both have such extensive trading networks throughout the world that they want commercial shipping to be able to operate freely throughout the world. And so that's another area, when you put aside the military tensions surrounding the sort of freedom of navigation issues, commercial shipping and global trading networks is another area where China and the US have interests that are broadly aligned. Well, I think for the US, it's to stop thinking about and treating China like an enemy. Because if you treat China like an enemy, China will become an enemy. And at the moment, China is certainly not the enemy of the United States, and is also not an existential threat to the United States. I just don't understand how anyone who really thinks about this issue could come to the conclusion that China represents an existential threat to the United States. Maybe China represents a threat to the unipolar world that the United States has enjoyed since the fall of the Cold War. But there are also other factors that are mitigating against the continuation of this unipolar world, the fact that we have other powers rising as well, but China is of course clearly the leading power. So yes, China does represent a threat to the unipolar dominance that America has enjoyed for sort of the last 30 years, but China does not represent an existential threat to the United States, either militarily, politically, economically, or in any other way. That's what I would say to the US side. And to the Chinese side, I would say just be patient with the US. And I think there's just a process in the US that needs to kind of run its course as the US adopts to this sort of new multipolar world where it's no longer the sole superpower. There's just a process of adjustment, a painful process of adjustment that the US needs to go through. And China just needs to be patient with that. And I think, China is really a country that understands the long game a lot better than the US does. I mean, I think the US kind of embarked upon this engagement with China back in the 70s and then really ramped it up during the Clinton administration in the hope that by engaging with China, they would change China into something that more resembled sort of the US model of political economy. And that sort of didn't really happen fast enough for the US. But China is still in the process of reforming, of evolving, of changing, and you've just got to give it time. I think there is convergence that's happening to a set of global norms. And it's hard to see that when, you've got these kind of headline events happening. It's hard to see that, nations are sort of converging towards a single sort of set of norms of what's acceptable behavior. And, the US shouldn't sort of give up on China so soon. Of course, China is a civilization that's much older than the US, and the central tenets of Chinese civilization, predate modern notions of republicanism and democracy by several thousand years. But still, I think the US should not give up on its goal of sort of transforming China. The US has already had a hugely transformative effect on China, and I would encourage the US not to give up on that process, but also to see China as China really is, and not as the US kind of wishes it to be. I think there's been a lot of wishful thinking in the US going back many, many decades already to the 1930s in terms of how the US would want China to be, and the US just has to accept China as it is, and China also has to accept the US as it is in all of its sort of messiness.